So the 2023 Formula 1 season has reached the halfway point. We're 12 races down and there's still another 10 to go. And this season has been all about Max Verstappen and Red Bull so far. So I thought I'd put together a bit of a kind of like mid-season review type of video. But instead of going through all of the teams and the drivers and give them a rating out of 10 for how they performed so far this year, I thought instead I'm going to pick some drivers on the grid that I think need to come back after the summer break and improve their form in the second half of the year because they've fallen below either theirs or the team's expectations. So without further ado, here are the 5 drivers that I think need to come back in the second half of the year and improve their form for the rest of 2023. The first driver that I'm going to pick that I think needs to improve in the second half of 2023 is going to be a bit of an obvious one, but I've gone for Red Bull's Sergio Perez, who really has experienced a lot of highs and a lot of lows in the first half of the year. Let's not forget how good his start of the season was though, winning 2 of the first 4 races, and he was a bit of an outside bet for the World Championship. A lot of people were tipping him maybe to be Max Verstappen's biggest threat and biggest challenge, someone that could maybe challenge him not just for a few races but actually could sustain a championship challenge throughout the whole of the season. But since his brilliant weekend in Baku, which for me was his strongest weekend of the season, winning the sprint race and then beating Max in a fair fight in a straight out and out duel between the 2 Red Bull drivers in the main Grand Prix, he has since just tailed off in terms of form. Despite having taken pole position in Miami, the fact that Max beat him from 9th on the grid in that race really was the start of his downfall in many regards. From then onwards, this is when the mistakes started to creep in. In Monaco, where he crashed in qualifying, for example, that began a run of 5 consecutive races where he failed to make Q3, and this left him having to recover too many places and therefore losing a lot of points to Max, who was starting at the front of the grid and continuing to win race after race after race. Just to sum up how much ground Checo has lost to Max in the World Championship, you've only got to go back and look at the run of races between Monaco and Silverstone, because that really tells you of when Checo's season began to unravel and when really his hope of challenging Max for the World Championship over the course of the season began to fade. So during those run of 5 races, while Max continued his winning streak, Checo only finished once on the podium, and he gave away a total of 85 points to Max, leaving him close to 100 points behind heading into the next Grand Prix in Hungary. And it was during this difficult patch that speculation began to gather about Sergio's future at Red Bull, despite the fact that he has a contract in place for 2024. But there is the suggestion that if his form continues to decline, then he could be replaced next year. But then after that, of course, that's when Sergio began to hit back and show the kind of form that he was showing in the first 4 races, when he recovered from a poor qualifying in Hungary to finish on the podium. And then at Spa, despite a difficult sprint race where he had a collision with Lewis Hamilton, he finished behind Max in second place in the main Grand Prix, albeit 32 seconds behind. But nevertheless, finishing second behind Max is the job that he needs to do. That's why Red Bull brought him in the first place. It's those kind of performances that Sergio needs to pull out more often in the second half of 2023. If he can't fight Max on a regular basis, then he needs to at least be finishing second behind him so that Red Bull is maximising their points haul over a Grand Prix weekend. But in saying that, I do think that Red Bull would like it if Sergio did close the current gap to Max, because it's no exaggeration to say that it has been quite large in the last few races. Max really has run rings around Sergio both in qualifying and the races. But trying to get in Red Bull's mind, I think they would like it if Sergio did provide more competition for Max at more of the races. He can't just rely on the fact that he's quick at street circuits. That has always been his forte. We saw it in Jeddah and Baku earlier in the season that he beat Max in a straight fight. But he needs now to take that form onto more traditional circuits. I think that will be the key, not just to Sergio's season but also his future, because he's got to prove to Red Bull that he is absolutely the right man to be in that car alongside Max, not just in 2024 but beyond that as well. He's got to deal with the pressure and the expectations that come with being in a top car. There is a lot at stake here, so Sergio really has got to grab the bull by the horns and improve in the second half of 2023. The next driver that I'm going to pick is George Russell, who really has had a disappointing second season at Mercedes considering how impressive he was in his first year in 2022. But for whatever reason, he is just not being able to extract the kind of performances that we saw from him last year, where he really was able to get the most out of the Mercedes package. But you'd have to say that so far this year, he really has been upstaged and outperformed by his teammate Lewis Hamilton. In fact, he's only managed to finish ahead of Hamilton on track in just 3 of the Grand Prix so far. And he has just the 1 podium finish so far in the first 12 races, which is 3 less than what Hamilton has. And on top of that, he's also losing the qualifying head-to-head to Hamilton 7-5, with Hamilton of course having a pole position in Hungary. George's best qualifying has been a front row start in Australia. I think that it has been quite a curious year for George, because although on the face of it, it looks as though he is having a bit of a difficult season, on the flip side, I think actually it isn't as bad as maybe it seems, because he is still scoring points regularly. He scored points in 10 of the first 12 races, and that has been a key part of why Mercedes is currently second in the Constructors' Championship. But I think that it's simply down to the fact that he is facing a current performance deficit to Hamilton and is losing that head-to-head battle, especially given how well he did alongside Hamilton in his first year in 2022, where he did beat Hamilton over the course of the season. He's one of only 3 drivers to have beaten Hamilton over an entire year. Part of this could lie with the fact that this year's Mercedes is arguably as difficult to drive as the 2022 Mercedes, despite the fact that it has cured the porpoising and the bouncing that it suffered last year. Both Russell and Hamilton have been quite open that the W14 does suffer with a lack of downforce and has an issue with balance, and that could be a key reason why Russell is struggling to adapt to this car more quickly than Hamilton has in the first half of the season. But even if the car is as difficult to drive as the team is making out, even Toto Wolff has referred to it as a Diva 2.0, the fact that Hamilton is able to extract more performance out of the car more consistently from track to track really does say a lot about how poor George has been so far this year, especially considering how highly rated he is, not just among the Mercedes team but also his rivals. He's been tipped to be a potential world champion in the future. So collectively you'd have to say that it's the points gap and the performance deficit to Hamilton that is reflecting poorly on George's season, and this is where he really has got to try and focus and improve in the second half of the season. Unlike some of the other drivers, he hasn't got to worry about his future. His seat at Mercedes is safe, at least for now. But if he is to prove that he is the man that Mercedes can rely on post Hamilton, when Hamilton does eventually hang up his helmet, then he really does have to pull his socks up and start finding some results. My third pick may come as a bit of a surprise to you, but I've gone with Ferrari's Carlos Sainz, who by his standards has been a bit out of sorts this year. We haven't seen the Carlos Sainz of the past few seasons in 2023. I think the way to sum up his season so far would be solid but unspectacular. It's a bit of a strange one with Carlos, because although he only sits 7 points behind his teammate Charles Leclerc in the World Championship standings and has actually got more points finishes to his name, he's been the more consistent scorer. It's always felt like this season that when the Ferrari has been at its most competitive and opportunities have been presented to them to score big points and even score podiums, it has been Charles rather than Carlos that has taken those opportunities. That can also be said of qualifying, because as it stands, Ferrari is the only other team other than Red Bull to have had a pole position this season, but it's Leclerc that has got those 2 pole positions rather than Sainz. And over the course of the season he has qualified relatively well. He started his home Grand Prix in Spain from the front row and has started in the top 3 at another 2 races, but it's in the races that where his season really has been a letdown. He is yet to stand on the podium in 2023, finishing a best of 4th at the first race of the season in Bahrain. I think that Carlos's situation at Ferrari is actually very similar to George Russell's situation at Mercedes, in the respect that he has a highly rated teammate that he doesn't beat as often as he should do. It always seems to be that he's just lagging behind Charles in many areas. If you look at qualifying, for example, even though the gap is always slight, it's no more than a tenth, it always seems to be that Charles is the lead Ferrari ahead of Sainz. And we know that from last year, when Ferrari designed a competitive car at the start of 2022, that Carlos initially struggled to adapt to the new car as quickly as Charles did. Charles was immediately able to jump into that car and be quick, whereas it took a few races for Carlos to get up to speed. But on the other hand, you probably have to say Carlos does have an advantage over Charles in the respect that he is the far more consistent driver, bringing the car home far more often in the points, and he is less likely to make mistakes than Charles, especially in high pressure situations. But nevertheless, you'd have to say that so far this season, Carlos has fallen short of expectations. He is not performing at a level that we used to see him at. We need to be seeing the Carlos Sainz that we saw during his 2 years at McLaren and his first year at Ferrari, where he was a consistent point scorer and always getting the most out of the package. Right at this moment, he is simply not doing that. And what I feel like I'm seeing from Carlos on track at the moment, it almost comes across as though he looks a bit lost. I feel like there's maybe some sort of distraction in the back of his mind. It could be to do with the fact that he wants to sort out his long-term future in Formula 1. We know that he has a contract with Ferrari for next year, but he's spoken openly about the fact that he wants his future for 2025 and beyond sorted before the start of next year. I'm sure that if you asked all of his teammates over his Formula 1 career, they'd all say that Carlos Sainz is an extremely difficult driver to beat on his day, but he does have a tendency every now and again to have an off weekend, and this simply is where he is lacking compared to the top drivers and where he must improve for the remainder of 2023. Moving on to my fourth pick now, and for this one I have gone with Lance Stroll, who really has been outshined and outperformed by his new Aston Martin teammate Fernando Alonso over the course of the season. This, out of all the teammate pairings on the grid, you'd probably have to say that on average is the biggest disparity between the two in terms of points and results. And the stats do not lie. Only once this season has Stroll managed to finish ahead of Alonso in a race, which was at the Spanish Grand Prix, and in qualifying he was currently 10-2 down. But even worse than that is the points disparity between the two, which is currently the second largest, only behind Sergio Perez and Max Verstappen at Red Bull. It is more than 100 points. But this is just part of the story, because it's plain to see that Lance is simply under-delivering in a competitive car. Aston has made a huge leap compared to last year, where it was 7th in the Constructors' Championship. It started the year as Red Bull's closest challengers, and in the hands of Alonso, it finished on the podium in 6th of the first 8 races. Whereas Lance is yet to finish higher than 4th in the Grand Prix this season. And it's this inconsistency that is starting to hurt Aston Martin's chances of finishing as high up in the Constructors' Championship as possible. The team recently slipped down to 3rd place in the Constructors' Championship behind Mercedes, but it is now at risk of falling even further down the order, as Ferrari now sits just 5 points behind them at the halfway stage of the season. But it is crystal clear that Stroll's inability to perform to Alonso's standards means that the team is lagging behind now its main rivals in Mercedes and Ferrari. And worse than that, with McLaren now picking up their form, there could be a chance that McLaren could catch them in the second half of the year, and they could fall to as low as 5th place. I mentioned it earlier in the year that Lance was becoming the weak link at Aston Martin, and the team simply could not ignore this fact anymore, especially if it wants to be considered a series contender for world championships and victories in the future. It needs not just a competitive car, it needs a competitive driver partnership, and right now they don't have that. It is getting harder and harder for Aston Martin to justify keeping Stroll in that second seat, especially as he's simply not performing to a level that is expected of a driver in a top team. I think he does lack a lot of ambition and determination, and probably that is down to the fact that his father is the team owner. So while his dad remains in charge of Aston Martin, I think that Lance will always feel that his place at the team is safe. What his dad needs to do is to try and give him a bit of a wake-up call and make it clear that his place at the team is not guaranteed in the long term. Whether this will have the desired effect or not, we won't know until the situation actually plays out for itself. But what is clear is that, competitive car or not, Lance is not performing, and him finding some form in the second half of the year could be key to where Aston Martin finishes in the overall standings come Abu Dhabi. My fifth and final pick for the drivers that need to improve in the second half of 2023 is Logan Sargeant, who's had a solid, if unspectacular, rookie season so far. That started off strongly in Bahrain, but has slowly drifted off course, with his inexperience beginning to show. Logan really has been tested both physically and mentally so far this year, and going up against a teammate in Alex Albon really has shown him the level that is required to be accepted into Formula 1 as a top performer. In this teammate pairing, you can really see how valuable experience is in Formula 1. Logan is yet to out-qualify Alex at any of the races so far this season, and is qualified no higher than 14th, only making it to Q2 on a couple of occasions. While Logan has shown glimpses of his speed, there has been the inevitable 1 or 2 rookie errors over the course of the season, but there has also been times where he has lost his head and frustration has got the better of him. Look back at Saudi Arabia as a classic example. He lost his lap time in qualifying due to exceeding track limits at the final corner on a lap that would have been good enough to see him advance into Q2. But on the subsequent laps he performed after, he made a couple of critical errors, including overworking the tyres, through frustration at seeing his best lap invalidated, and this was key into why he didn't make it into the next session. I have to say that apart from Nick de Vries, who was sacked by AlphaTauri in the middle of the season, that Logan has been the clear underperformer on the grid this year. He is just one of 3 drivers to have driven in the Grand Prix in 2023 and still at this point in the season not have a World Championship point to his name. But aside from his results, it's his deficit to Albon that is a real concern for Williams, and that one that needs addressing in the second half of the year. Even though Williams has been fully supportive of Logan during his rookie season, and after all he is their academy driver, there is a risk of him losing his seat at the team in 2024 if his performances do not improve. A number of drivers have been linked with replacing him for next year, with the likes of Mick Schumacher and Alex Palou, just a couple of examples. I actually don't think this situation will faze Logan whatsoever, because I think he's just so focused about getting the most out of himself and the car at the moment. There's no doubt about it that he deserves his chance in Formula 1. He well and truly earned it, especially when you consider that his racing career nearly ended in 2021. His journey to Formula One has been far from easy, but it's been great seeing an American driver back on the grid. In fact, it's been far too long since we had one. So I think that if Logan wants to secure his future at Williams, he's simply got to deliver more than he is doing at this moment in time. So there you have it. There are my 5 picks for the drivers that I think need to improve in the second half of 2023. But now I want to hear what yours are. Do you agree with any of mine, or do you have any of your own? Be sure to let me know in the comment section. And also don't forget to leave a like on the video and to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.